How do you respond when people hurt you? That's the question this morning. We're going to talk about those relationships, those moments when people wrong you. And I don't mean a misunderstanding, and I don't mean the things that are just easy to let go of. But what do you do when someone really hurts you? If you had asked me that for most of my life, I would have told you probably quite pridefully that it's not that hard. I just, I let it go. I'm wired to just kind of be emotionally even-keeled. I don't get angry easily. And so like most of my life, people do something wrong to me or whatever, I just forget about it and I move on. I kind of inherited that from my dad. He's like the most even-keeled person in the world. I don't have a single memory as a child of my dad yelling at me. It's an incredible feat for a father, and I haven't been able to repeat it personally, but it was an amazing thing. And so it came naturally to me to be able to just move on and forgive. And then I realized I wasn't as good at it as I thought I was about 5 years ago. I was really hurt by some people, and it was a hurt that was deeper than anything I'd experienced before, and it was the first time in my life that I realized that I didn't know how to forgive, that I didn't know how to move on, that there was an anger that I had that seemed like it kind of controlled me in ways that I just wasn't used to experiencing. Maybe you've experienced that before. I remember one day in that period, I was taking a shower and I was kind of caught off guard realizing that the water was running cold. And I kind of like snapped out of it and realized that I had been standing in the shower for like 20 minutes having an imaginary argument in my head, trying to prove my point that so-and-so was wrong and that I was right and trying to make them look bad. I mean, have you ever done that? And so what do we do? How do you respond to people who have hurt you? We're going to look at that question this morning. We're going to open a new book of our Bible, 2 Samuel this morning. We've been in the life of David for a long time, and we're turning the page now. If you want to turn there in your Bible, we're in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And I want to get us caught up to where we are, because it's a really critical point in the story. We've been following the life of David, and he's been promised that he's going to be the king of Israel, but it hasn't happened yet. The king is this man named Saul. And this is the moment in the story where Saul's reign, where his life comes to an end. If you were with us last Sunday, then you heard Jack do a great job of unpacking just a really bizarre passage in our story in chapter 28 when Saul disobeys God, and in this moment of panic, he decides to go to a witch and have this spiritual medium try to raise up a spirit to give him direction. And it actually happens. This medium encounters the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who's been dead now for a few chapters. And Samuel, from the grave, speaks to Saul. And again, if you want to get into that, it's an amazing story. You can go look at Jack's message from last week. But what I want us to remember from that chapter is what Samuel told Saul. He told a prophecy. And so the spirit of Samuel from the grave spoke to Saul and said this: "The Lord will also hand Israel over to the Philistines along with you. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, and the Lord will hand Israel's army over to the Philistines." This prophecy, remember, this is Samuel speaking from the grave. When he says, "You'll be with me," he's saying, you will die. Saul, you and your sons are going to die. Israel's going to be defeated. And the book of 1 Samuel comes to an end with that prophecy being fulfilled. That's exactly what happens. Israel and the Philistines go to war. It's a horrible battle for Israel. The army flees, and they lose a ton of people, and the Philistines pursue them, and eventually they even catch up with the royal contingent, and 3 of Saul's sons are killed by the Philistines, and the archers, they shoot Saul, and he's wounded gravely, and he realizes that he's not going to be able to get away, and he's overcome with terror over what the Philistines will do to him if they capture him alive, because he knows what happens to the kings of defeated enemies. He's done it himself as king of Israel to enemies they've defeated. He doesn't want to be tortured, and he doesn't want to be dragged through the streets as a trophy, and so he takes his own life. And that is the tragic end of King Saul and of his dynasty and of his reign as king over Israel. He was a man who started with all kinds of promise, was overcome with pride, couldn't repent from his sins, wouldn't submit to God, and ends in tragedy, a total failure as king. We're not going to focus on that story this morning because Jack did a great job of unpacking that for us last week. This morning, we're going to turn the page into 2 Samuel chapter 1, and we're going to look at David's response to hearing that news. David is not there for this battle. He is elsewhere. He's been having kind of his own crisis of sorts. He's been going through this long period of not making good decisions, of rejecting God himself, and he even kind of became friends with the Philistines recently, which is a really weird thing and not a good thing at all. But he's had kind of this spiritual revival just recently. He's trusting God again. He's responding to God again. God has just shown his grace to David by delivering him from this really terrible situation where his family and the family of his men were all captured by Amalekites, and God rescued them and saved them. And so David is full of gratitude right now, and he's closer to God than he's been in a long, long time. But he's away from this battle, and he doesn't know what happened. And so our story picks up in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel with a messenger who is running from this battle where Saul and Jonathan have died. And he comes to bring David news. And he tells David, look, there's been this huge battle that just took place. And David is on the edge of his seat. He wants to know what happened. This is verse 4 of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. What was the outcome? Tell me, David asked him. The troops fled from the battle, he answered. Many of the troops have fallen and are dead. Also, Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. And David, he has to take in this news. And it is hard to overstate how big this news is for David personally. Like, what he just heard, it's the biggest announcement he's ever heard in his entire life. And to understand why it's so big, you have to understand a few different angles of what just happened, okay? David just heard 3 things at once. Any one of them would be massive, okay? The first thing he just heard, he just found out that his best friend is dead. That's the first thing that the messenger says, is that Jonathan is dead. Jonathan was David's best friend. He was the closest relationship of David's whole life. And that's not an overstatement. David was closer with Jonathan than he was with his own wives. He never has a closer relationship with anyone than with Jonathan. Jonathan was loyal to him, even though Jonathan was the son of David's enemy, of King Saul. And that relationship has come to an end because Jonathan, though he didn't do anything wrong, got sucked into the vortex of sin and rebellion of his father Saul, and now he's been killed at the hands of the Philistines as well. It's the first thing he just heard. His best friend is dead. The second thing we learn from that messenger is that David's greatest enemy is dead also. King Saul is dead. And David has no greater enemy than King Saul. No one will hurt David more than King Saul hurt David. And if you haven't been with us in this series, let me just catch you up a little bit. Here's the highlights of what Saul has done to David over the last decade, okay? Saul personally, with his own hand, with his own spear, has tried to kill David twice. He also, when that didn't work, ordered his best troops to go kill David. Saul also manipulated David into marrying his daughter. He manipulated David into marrying into his family, and it was actually like a whole ruse just to get David killed again by having to go and fight the Philistines as kind of a condition of the marriage. After David flees, when David is still alive and Saul knows it, Saul takes David's wife from him and gives her away in marriage to someone else. Okay? Then Saul spends a decade pursuing David, trying to kill him in the wilderness. He makes David's life kind of a living hell for 10 years. He's always on the run. He doesn't have a home, nowhere to lay his head. He's a wandering fugitive. Saul massacres an entire village of priests and their families just because he thinks that they may have helped David. And David has that on his conscience now. And Saul has just lied constantly about David. He's slandered him. He's impugned his character. He's falsely claimed that David is kind of leading this coup against him, even though nothing could be further than the truth. That is what Saul has done to David. He is David's greatest enemy, and now he's dead as well. And that means that, thirdly, what David hears is this piece of news, that David's path to the throne is clear. See, years and years ago, God promised David that he would be king of Israel, but that has never been able to take place because Saul has been in the way. Saul has been the king. And so David has had this promise, for most of his life, but never had any realistic path to God fulfilling it. And now, for the first time, that's changed. The king is dead. The crown is at David's feet right there. The messenger brought him Saul's crown. And for the first time ever, David can see how God might actually be fulfilling his promise to him. So, David is just taking in wave after wave of this information. And obviously, there's a mix of things going on in his head. But I asked you this morning, what we do, how we respond to people who have hurt us. And I want to focus in with you a little bit on this news that David just heard, that King Saul has been killed. That his enemy, that this man who has done so much wrong to him, that he's gone. And I want to ask you, how would you feel? How would you respond to hearing that news? How do we respond when the people who've hurt us get what they deserve? I'll tell you one way we respond. There's a word for it. It's called Schadenfreude. The Germans came up with that. It means taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. And I think you probably know how that feels a little bit. Even when it's not personal, like when you see the news story of the person who, has done all kinds of horrible things and is really not a good person, and they finally get what they deserve. They get justice. They're arrested. They get put in jail. There's a scandal, whatever. Doesn't that kind of feel good when you read that? Am I the only one? You guys are looking at me like I'm the only one who feels that way. I know, okay? Even in your personal life, though, if you think about the person in your workplace who you hate to work with because they're a jerk and they don't do their job, and it seems like they just get away with it. There's no repercussions whatsoever. But then one day you find out that person was fired because they're bad at their job and they're a jerk. You smile a little bit, do you not? The closer it gets to home, I think the more it can kind of be this way. Your sibling who's never treated you well your whole life, and now you're adults and you're not close because that relationship has just always been hard. And you find out that their life's not really going the way they wanted to. You don't outwardly smile, but inside you're you kind of like that too, Again, stop looking at me like that. I'm not the only one who feels this way. Here's the thing. It's an honest human reaction. Sometimes the way we respond to people who have hurt us is we take pleasure in their misfortune. And this is a huge moment for David to do that. Put yourself in David's shoes. If you just found out that Saul was dead, how would you respond? You're with your men. You've been on the run from him forever. I'll tell you how I would respond. We would be breaking out the champagne, right? The dance music would be coming on. We'd be throwing a party. That's how I would respond. And when we look at David's response in this passage, it's kind of bizarre because he doesn't respond in that very human way that I think would make so much sense to us. He finds out this horrible news, and this is the very next verse. It says, that's David and his men, they mourned, wept, and fasted until the evening for those who died by the sword. And of course, you're like, that's good, that's classy, right? A lot of people have died, good people have died. Let's start by mourning before we party. And so that's what they do. But then the verse goes on, and it says something just really weird, okay? They're mourning, and it says, they mourned, they wept, they fasted until the evening for those who died by the sword, for Saul, his son Jonathan, the Lord's people, and the house of Israel. And you're like, okay, you mourned for Jonathan, of course, right? You mourned for the Lord's people, you should. You mourned for the house of Israel, yes. But Saul? David, really? You're mourning for Saul? I don't even believe it, right? When you read that, that must be some sort of formality, some sort of show that he's putting on. He can't honestly be mourning for Saul after what Saul has done for him. And yet you keep on reading this chapter and you realize that it actually isn't a show, that David is being genuine in his choice to honor this man who has hurt him so deeply, to treat him well even though he doesn't deserve it. And the way you see that that's real is in two ways. The first is the way that he responds to the messenger who brought him this news. And this is kind of a weird story in this chapter. It's kind of funny in a dark way. This messenger who comes to David is an Amalekite. And what really happens is that this guy probably saw the battle happening, and he was most likely a scavenger. After the battle was over, he probably went out into the battlefield just trying to find things of value and things that he could sell. And he comes across the score of a lifetime. He comes across the crown of Israel, Saul's crown that had fallen off his head somewhere or whatever. And he knows that Saul and that Jonathan are dead. And now he has this royal crown and the royal armband. And he realizes what this means. He knows about the rivalry between David and Saul. He knows that David has been promised to be king and that Saul's dead. And so he decides to take this to David and tell him what happened. And on the way, he apparently kind of starts to come up with some ideas of how he might be able to benefit from this. And so the story that he tells David, it's not the whole truth. It's a little bit of a white lie, okay? He tells David that Saul is dead, which is true. But rather than tell him that Saul took his own life, which is what happened, the Amalekite tells David that he was the one who killed Saul. That actually he took his own sword and struck down Saul. And of course, he's telling David this because he thinks it's going to earn him favor with David. He's imagining the party that I was talking about, and he thinks he's going to be the guest of honor because he's the one who killed David's enemy. He's probably going to get a reward of some kind. And so he tells David, I'm the one who killed King Saul. And that just doesn't go the way that he thought it was going to go because David kills him. That's what happens. He tells him, your blood is on your own head because you said that you struck down the Lord's anointed, and David has one of his men go and just kill him on the spot. And it's pretty intense, and you might be able to argue that it was overkill, but the purpose of this story is for you to understand David apparently means it when he says that he's going to honor Saul, and he's not going to celebrate Saul's death. That he's mourning this reality that the king of Israel, who God appointed, has been slain. David apparently is genuine in his response here of honoring that reality, even though Saul didn't personally deserve it. And then you see it again as the chapter concludes, with David writing this song of lament. This is the rest of the chapter are the lyrics to this song that David teaches his men and that they all sing together. And it's a song of mourning about this horrible thing that just happened. In the song of lament, David honors Saul just as much as he honors Jonathan, just as much as he honors everyone else. It's this really kind of bizarre thing. So this is verse 17. David sang the following lament for Saul and his son Jonathan. I'm not going to read you the whole song. You can go read it if you want. It's the second half of chapter 1. I'm just going to bring one verse, okay? This is one verse from the song to show you David's heart towards Saul and Jonathan here. Saul and Jonathan, loved and delightful. They were not parted in life or death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. Now, I know that we all kind of talk better about people when they're dead than we would otherwise. But this is so honoring of Saul. It's bordering on just outright false, right? Like, Saul, loved and delightful? I don't know that I would say that. You know, like Saul, I'm sure someone loved him, and I'm sure he had a couple delightful days, but like, that is certainly not what he was known for. And like Saul and Jonathan, they weren't parted in life or death. Well, I mean, Saul did try to kill Jonathan that one time, and I don't know. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. It seemed like Saul mostly tried to get other people to fight his battles for him because he was a coward, but like, this is a really honoring thing to say of Saul, and it's not a joke, and it's not sarcastic. This is David just truly honoring Saul after death. Have you ever been to the funeral of a complicated person where you like know the full story, and you hear the people talking on stage, and you're like, that's a bit more positive than I would have described this person. I mean, that's kind of what's happening here with this song. And so the question is, why? Like, why isn't David kind of reveling in this moment? He several times passed on the opportunity to kill Saul himself because he said, it's not my place. This is the Lord's anointed one. I'm not going to raise my hand against him. But that's not what happened here. This is God's action. God brought justice on Saul. And it seems like David could at least, crack a smile here in some small way. His life is going to be so much better now that Saul is gone. But David's showing us something here about how we respond to people who have harmed us. And he's showing us, in particular, that how we respond is a choice. And that's what I want to focus on in with you here. How you respond to people is a choice. Even people who have hurt you, even people who have wronged you, even those that have never asked for forgiveness, Saul certainly never did. You don't have to respond to them with bitterness, with resentments. You don't have to take pleasure in their downfall. How you respond is a choice. And I think often we don't feel that way. We feel like our response to people who have harmed us is almost involuntary. And the reason is because there's an aspect where that's actually true, okay? How you respond to people is a choice, but anger is a reaction, actually. Anger is an emotion. Anger is a human response to injustice, especially injustice that has affected you personally. It's actually just how God wired you. Anger, at least initially, is not a choice. It's just an emotional reaction. When you are harmed by somebody, you will get angry. But when you get angry, then you have a choice of what to do with that anger. And in that moment, knowing what you know about the person who's harmed you. Anger is a reaction, but bitterness is a choice. See, bitterness is the choice to hang on to that anger, to meditate on it, to sit in it, to not challenge it, to not process it, to not move past it. Bitterness is a choice to sit in your anger. Resentment is a choice. Resentment is a choice to focus on the person who's harmed you and what they've done, and to think about it and to let that define that person in your mind, and to let that define your relationship with them, and to let that define every aspect of your history with them and your future and all of that. Like, that is a choice of what you do in your anger. And finally, forgiveness is a choice. In your anger, when someone really has harmed you, to forgive, to not hold it over them. That is a choice that we can make as well. And it's actually one of the hardest choices that Jesus calls us to as his followers. The choice to love not only your friend and not only your neighbor, but to love your enemy as well, to choose to forgive those who have harmed you. Jesus calls us to that, and David is giving us just this tiny window into that reality, that that's possible. It is possible, no matter how deeply you've been harmed, to choose to forgive and to honor someone even though they don't deserve it. Why do you think God calls us to that? Why does God call us to forgive those who have harmed us? I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, one, the unwillingness or the inability to forgive, it just allows sin to spiral and to cycle and for us to keep hurting each other over and over and over again. It never ends. But I think another reason is because he loves us, he loves you, and he knows that choosing not to forgive, that choosing bitterness, that choosing resentment, it actually ends up hurting you more than it hurts anybody else. And so in love, he calls us to let go of that. I was thinking about this week, and it reminded me of the story of someone you probably have heard of. This is Nelson Mandela. And he is known worldwide for his choice to forgive. Nelson Mandela was born in 1918, I believe, in South Africa. And he was born into a moment in time where South Africa had this racist segregation system called apartheid that really oppressed black people in that country. And Nelson Mandela, he joined the movement that was resisting apartheid and trying to bring about change. And he was a lawyer, and he fought for that. And when he was in the prime of his life, when he was about 40 years old, he got arrested and put in prison because he was a part of the anti-apartheid movement. And he ended up being in prison for 27 years, right in the prime of life. And he lost so much because of that reality. He was forced into hard labor. He was separated from his wife and children. He was only allowed one 30-minute visit with them once every 6 months. His mother and his son, they both died while he was in prison, and he wasn't allowed to go to the funerals. While he was in there, his family was mistreated and abused by the authorities, and he was powerless to do anything to protect them. He's there for 27 years unjustly because all he was doing was fighting for equal rights and for the protection of black people in South Africa. You may know how his story ends. In the end, the movement he was a part of succeeds and ends the apartheid regime in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela actually is released from prison and ends up becoming the first black president of South Africa. But the reason why God was able to use him in that way is because despite everything that was done to him, he made an intentional choice to forgive the people who brought all that pain and hurt into his life. All kinds of quotes are attributed to Mandela about forgiveness. One of my favorites is that to hold on to anger is like drinking poison, hoping the other person will die. And the truth is, we don't actually know if he said that, but we know that he said this when he was reflecting on being released from prison after 27 years and thinking about the people who were responsible for keeping him there. He wrote in his autobiography this: "As I walked out the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." See, he had hatred, he had anger, he had bitterness, and it was justified. He had been wronged in tremendous ways. But he said, look, I knew that path was only going to lead me to still being shackled, to still being in prison. It was going to have an effect on me that I didn't want. And so I chose to forgive. And that is what Jesus calls us to do in response to people who have harmed us. And maybe you understand that as you think this morning about the person who's wronged you. Maybe it's right now, maybe it's fresh, or maybe it's a long, long time ago. Maybe you know, okay, Jesus does call me to forgive this person. And maybe you even know, like, it would be best for me to forgive this person. I would be better off if I did. That still leaves you with a pretty significant question, which is, how? Okay, it's a choice. How do you choose to forgive? It's not as easy as it sounds. Like, might even say, I've tried, I am forgiving, I want to forgive, I have forgiven, but that anger is still there, and the way that I think about this person is still there, and it hasn't changed. How can I choose to forgive? And I don't claim to be an expert at this, and it's certainly not something I have always been able to put in practice in my own life. But I do want to share with you just one truth about that as we close this morning that I hope will be helpful to you, has been helpful to me. It's a truth about how we can forgive people. And the reality is that God's grace is what empowers us to be gracious. When you think about how you can forgive someone who's harmed you, you think about how you can be gracious towards even an enemy, you have to realize that the ability to do that, it doesn't come from you. It doesn't come from trying harder. It doesn't come from your belief that you're a good person. It doesn't come by using logic and reasoning to talk about why it's not actually as big of a deal as you've made it or anything like that. Those things maybe can have some small effect for a brief period of time. But the actual power to forgive, it comes not from you, but from God's grace towards you. And if you want to choose forgiveness, if you want to forgive someone, the best thing you can do is take your attention and your focus and your perspective and take it off of the person who's harmed you and what they've done and put it on to the reality of God's grace in your life. And I want to give you just 3 specific, tangible, hopefully very practical ways that you can do that if you want to forgive those who have harmed you. 3 ways you can focus on God's grace. If you want to choose forgiveness over bitterness, the first thing you can do is focus on God's grace in forgiving you. So the Bible tells us this in Romans 5. It says, "For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, then how much more, having been reconciled, will be saved by his life?" And what Paul is referencing here is this reality that we actually all were in the place of being God's enemies. We didn't want God. We didn't deserve God. We weren't even asking for God's help. And yet, in that moment, God pursued us anyways. He came into our world, took on the form of a man, and in Jesus Christ, he took on our sin and went to the cross on our behalf and rose again to give us new life that we didn't deserve. And that foundational truth of the gospel is one of the most powerful things that you can focus on when someone has harmed you. Because the more that you can believe that truth, the more that you can celebrate that truth, the more that you can express your gratitude for the reality that when you were God's enemy, he came and forgave you, the harder it will be to withhold forgiveness from someone else at the same time. So the first thing you can do is focus on God's grace in forgiving you. The second thing is you can focus on God's grace in using your suffering. And I think so often that's why it's so hard to forgive someone, is because what they've done to us, the harm they've caused, it has led to suffering. It hurts us in ways that often can't be undone, that there's no remedy for. There's pain that we just have to sit with. And when we think about what we've gone through, when we think about the fact that it's somebody else's fault, that produces the anger and the bitterness and the resentment. And one of the amazing realities of God's grace that in the midst of suffering we often don't want to think about, but that really is true, is that God, he allows us to endure suffering. He doesn't promise that he'll take it away, but he promises that he'll use it. He promises that it won't be wasted. He promises that even in the midst of some of the hardest things you'll go through, he will still be at work through those very things for good. We see that reality in an amazing way in one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament, the story of Joseph from Genesis chapter 50. Joseph, if you know, he was betrayed by his own brothers. He was beaten. He was thrown into a pit. He was sold into slavery, taken to Egypt, where he was falsely accused of rape and thrown into prison. And he lived his life away from his family. And towards the end of his life, he encountered his brothers once again, who were responsible for all the things that had happened to Joseph. And he forgives them. And what he says is this, in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He says, "You planned evil against me, but God planned it for good." And this is so big because it doesn't negate the evil, right? Joseph says, you planned evil. You did evil things to me. That's still true. It doesn't erase that reality. But also, God was at work for good in the midst of it. He was faithful. He stayed with me the entire time. He redeemed things that you tried to take from me. And so I can forgive, not because you deserve it, but because of what God was faithful to do through it. If you want to see that in your life, you'll be able to see God work in that same way for you as well. Lastly, what you can focus on is you can focus on God's grace in healing all things. Like I said, that God doesn't promise that he'll take suffering away from us in this life. He promises that he'll use it. And there's going to be things that happen to you. There's going to be people who harm you in such a way that it just feels like there really is no way of healing it. There's no remedy. There's no way to undo what has been done. And that might be true here and now, but it's not true forever. And when we read the end of the story in the Bible and we see God's promises to us about what is coming, what God promises is a reality that he's not going to let suffering and hurt and pain be the end of the story. That one day he's going to wipe away every tear. That one day he's going to undo everything that sin has done in this world. And the promise is that he will make everything new. That is what the risen Jesus promises us in the book of Revelation, chapter 21. John looks in this vision and says, "Then the one seated on the throne said, 'Look, I am making everything new.'" Everything. Every hurt, every pain, every wrong that's been done to you, everything that you can't let go of, all of it, God says, I'm going to undo it all. And so the invitation, it's to choose to forgive. It's to choose to move on. Not because the pain's not real, not because the hurt isn't as big of a deal as you're making it. There's no minimizing going on there at all. But God's just saying, look, I created everything by just speaking it into existence. I have all power in the universe, and I'm telling you, I'm going to make it new. You can trust me. You can give this to me and let me handle it, and you can move on, you can forgive, and you can let go. And so I hope that you have a relationship in mind this morning. I hope that you have someone in your mind, someone who's hurt you. And as we worship this morning, my invitation is just, would you bring that reality to Jesus today? Would you acknowledge that it's real? Would you acknowledge your hurt and your pain and your anger? Would you bring it to him? And then would you ask for the power of the Spirit to work in your life to help you choose, not bitterness, not resentment, but to choose forgiveness and to walk forward in the grace of God together? Would you bow your heads? Let's pray for that. Father, we thank you for the reality that you pursued us when we didn't deserve it, when we didn't even ask for it, that you came after us when we were still your enemies, that you love us in a way that goes beyond anything we could even imagine. And so we ask, God, that you would help us to be people who focus on your grace, that you would help us to take our eyes off of some of the ways we've been hurt and onto the way that you've been faithful, that you've been good, that you promise to continue to be good in our lives. Would you help us to live in a way that makes the reality of the gospel clear to those who know us, who see us, who know our stories? And would you give us that hope of the reality of your promise that one day you will make everything new? We ask that together in the name of Jesus. Amen.